Now, normally I'd stand before you today and say, I want more power.
I haven't got the power. Try, man, try. Power, more power. Man's power, man.
I'm actually looking for less power. Now, I don't mean less power on performance. What I actually mean is less power from the electrical side of things. I don't necessarily want my home lab to be burning a massive hole in my ever-decreasing wallet with its just constant energy consumption that we get from running a home lab 24/7. Now, the reason energy consumption is important when you think of your home lab, for example, is you probably fall into several different scenarios. Most people will run their home lab for a little bit of tinkering, therefore you potentially have the option to power on and power down. Some people will run it to constantly run services that happen. So for example, Pi-hole, Home Assistant, those kind of solutions need to run 24/7 because one, supplying your DNS and ad blocking service, and the other is basically running your smart home. There are also others that you may have for very different reasons that will run various services that are important to you from your home lab. I certainly have some that run all the time, all year round, 24/7. Therefore, what they're running on is probably the most important thing to me, because idling, say for example, at 180 watts or maybe even 240 watts is not possibly the best thing to be doing, particularly at the moment where energy prices in Europe or even in the UK where I'm from are probably at an all-time high. Now, the reality is they probably shouldn't be as high as they are, but unfortunately not every single supplier has passed on any potential savings in the market to us end users. So what I decided to do was look at a way to reduce my current energy consumption footprint in my home lab by replacing, again, my home lab system. So I come upon the decision to, one, I could go and look around Reddit, the forums, YouTube. Everybody's kind of done a little swing and take on how to make stuff more energy efficient. I've seen a few recently by very different YouTubers that I follow. One going on about, build your own and get, find a nice spreadsheet that basically lists the ideal power consumption and the C states for the particular motherboard processors, etc., and what works together. The problem is that's a very fine art, and to be honest, the challenge around looking at what C states are, and if you're not sure what they are, it's just there. But C states generally aren't always in your control, because let's be honest, you could buy the most energy efficient motherboard, CPU, memory, hard drives, etc., and you suddenly decide, right, I need 10 gigabit connection for this. You put in a 10 gigabit network card and bang, your energy performance has gone that way. And the reason for that is, unfortunately, not every single manufacturer has, one, either updated their firmware, two, has the support for those various C states, and three, it might be very outdated technology. So therefore, you think years ago necessarily it wasn't always about being green and being energy efficient, but it was more about let's get the raw power. And don't get me wrong, I still want raw power, and that's why I've kind of gone for the lineup I've had. Now, I decided on 3 mini PCs to go through this. Now, my end goal was to use all 3 in my cluster. However, I decided to take one out and just run with the 2. Now, there is a reason for that, and it's not energy related, believe it or not. So when I show you the chart in a moment, you'll actually see that that was probably one of the most energy efficient. And believe it or not, it was from AMD. Yes. You hear a lot of people will talk about AMD and them not being energy efficient, or their idle efficiency not being as good as others. But that was a pretty consistent performer. So why I'm not using it in my home lab is for very different reasons. Now, that doesn't mean necessarily I won't use it there long term, but at the moment I just want to look at something or two devices that can run as a cluster. Obviously, I won't have full quorum because I won't have three, but at least I'll have two devices to run through. So without further ado, here's the three devices I chose and their price point, and a little bit around their performance, cost, and most importantly, their power consumption. So let's drill down into it, and I will stick Amazon links in the description for all of these, but let's just kind of cycle through very, very quickly the kind of breakdown. So like I mentioned, the very first one is an Intel NUC. It's a 12 mini PC, Wall Street Canyon, with an i5 1240p, which basically means it has 12 cores in total and 16 threads. But how that's broken down is it has 4 performance cores and 8 efficiency cores. Has a total maximum burst via the boost as 4.4 gigahertz. Now this one comes with 32 gig DDR4. Like I said, with the storage, I've generally kept it consistent across the board. Obviously, the only difference realistically is the Intel NUC with the additional memory, but pretty much everything else should almost be like for like. It's a little bit harder with the NVMe, but each of the NVMe is the stock one that was provided, which was 500 gig or 512 at the very top. And the SSD storage I installed was Corsair 500 gig, and the SSDs was exactly the same model across the board. Now the TDPs are rated as 28 watts for this. Now realistically, the average idle I noticed with this was probably around 20 watts. Now I did this over a period of probably an hour. However, that was under some load, so that was doing stuff like running Windows, doing some general testing. It wasn't used in my clustered environment. What I have seen since I've run it in the clustered environment of somewhere around the 8 watts, it kind of goes up and down, but realistically it's not a million miles from 8 the most of the time. The maximum burst I saw was 50. That's when I started to stress test it a little bit, and that's where we went. Now I won't talk too much about the scores, we'll go through that in a moment in some charts, but they are there. Now the price was £600. And moving on to the B-Link 12 Gen Intel Mini, it's an Alder Lake N100. 4 cores, 4 threads, maximum clock speed of 3.4 gigahertz under boost, 16 gig DDR4, again 500 gig, with a TDP rating for this CPU of only 6 watts. And that's probably what helps with some of this. The average idle was the lowest I saw of all of these. However, it wasn't consistent. It did generally fluctuate quite a lot between 11 and 25. Most of the time it kind of moved up and down, but if I took the average, it was around 11. The lowest I saw it was a very minimum of 6, and again that was since I've moved it into my cluster environment when it's sitting there doing very little. Obviously the a Linux or Proxmox Debian deployment is not going to do a lot if it's not actually running anything. Again, we won't discuss the actual scoring at this point, but we will come on to that. Now, next one was the Nipoggy Ryzen Mini PC, which has a Ryzen 5 500U, which has 6 cores and 12 threads, a maximum clock speed of 4 gigahertz, 16 gig. Again, it's not DDR5, it is DDR4. That's a typo. Again, 500 and 515. Now, this one was bizarrely the most consistent across the board. When I say the average idle and the lowest was 15, it generally, most of the time, stuck at 15. And that's why I said actually it might not be that bad from a consistency point of view. However, the maximum burst I ever witnessed was 25 watts. It never actually went above that. No matter what I tried to do, I couldn't get it to go above 25 watts at any given time. Now, you'll probably see, if you look on the very far end there, the OpenCL score is probably the main reason why I'm going to do something very different with that, and we'll kind of come on to that in a moment. But the price for this was $279. Now, I need to caveat that. The general recommended retail price for these seems to be $399. However, that was vouchered, but I'll be honest, these are vouchered quite often. The voucher is not applicable to me now because you can only use it once, but I can guarantee if you went on the link that I send you, you probably will likely be able to apply a £120 voucher to bring that price down. So if we now go to look at the performance levels, so obviously I've got them there, but I've mapped them out in a little chart. So if we look at the performance, you can kind of see, which is no surprise whatsoever, that the Intel NUC absolutely dominates here. Now that's not a surprise because if you think of the price to performance ratio for this, it's actually not that bad. Now, if you were probably going to look at a price to performance, you probably would say the Ryzen is, wow, I mean, you know, for the price that we paid for that, it is half the price of this, and it doesn't necessarily have half the performance. So am I probably making the wrong decision not to use it in my cluster at this point? Possibly not. Now, there is a reason for that. Ryzen and AMD CPUs sometimes have some challenges around with Linux. Not massive, and it doesn't seem to be quite often, but you know, nevertheless, people have had challenges around that. Just basically around having to disable seed states, which kind of negates some of this challenge. Now, the one thing I will say is the B-Link Mini S, I did have to do some additional configuration to, which I'll cover off in the full review of this to actually get it to work with Proxmox. But realistically, for the price I paid for this, again, it was £194. It's not bad, is it? I mean, realistically, if you're going to do, you know, very minimal tasks on that, it does pretty much deliver on that front. Now, when we move on to the OpenCL scores, again, this is where the Ryzen come into its own, which is no surprise because it is an APU. And the APU in this has got, I really believe, around the equivalent of 6 cores or 6 threads that it applies to it, with a maximum speed of 1.8 or 1800 megahertz. So I'm expecting it to perform pretty well with games, and I'll be honest, I did notice the graphical fidelity just doing some testing around 4K and running 4K videos. It did seem to handle them quite well, even though considering it hasn't got Intel QuickSync technology, it could still handle those kind of things. Now, both of these do, so both of the Intel variants do support QuickSync. So, you know, if you're going to use this for something like a Plex server, either of those would do an absolutely fine job. And to be honest, Ryzen machines or APUs, you know, they have kind of, depending on encoding levels and what kind of codec you use, if you're going to use OpenGL or, you know, FFmpeg, you're probably fine. But when you start to use some, you know, you don't have the ability to use NVEnc for encoding, so you do lose out a little bit there. Now, when we actually look at the performance in watts, and I'll just drag this over a little bit, that realistically, you know, you can see that the Intel NUC does really max out when it wants to. It didn't stay at that level for long, but certainly when it span up, it kind of pushed to that 50 watt mark. But that being said, that's still well under the general idle speed of something I've been running 24/7. So this to be my mainstay machine, when it's generally idling at around 8, but I'd say a very maximum, this has been probably been a bit harsh on the device. It did sit around 20 quite a lot, but that again was in Windows. So, realistically, you take some of that headroom off, I imagine we'd probably be pushing to, not probably dissimilar too much from the Ryzen with the 15 watt mark. Now, where the N100 come in was from an efficiency point of view, wow, this was very impressive because it did average at 11 watts. And again, that's in Windows. When it got into just the Linux and Debian and from the Proxmox environment, it's sitting happily now at around 6 watts, which is pretty scary. And there are people that have done different reviews on this and seen very similar real-term theoretical numbers and also practical numbers. So again, that's pretty pretty good. Now, like I said, when it comes to consistency, the Ryzen, my God, when it says it has 15 watts, it generally means it has 15 watts, and it sits there quite happily. like I said, it did peak. Now, the one thing with this device, it was the noisiest. So when this ramped up, you could certainly hear the fans spin up. The other two, you can't hear. They are absolutely whisper quiet. So if you're looking for something to do for just general desktop day-to-day, you wasn't necessarily looking at this to do use for, sort of a workstation or gaming rig, absolutely those would fulfill that need because they are ultra quiet. If you want something with a little bit more grunt when it comes to graphical processing, if you want to do, probably larger scale emulation or various other bits, the Ryzen is probably where you are. That being said, that wasn't what we were covering today. So they are the performance metrics for these three devices. So, to summarise, this one I'm obviously not going to use. And yes, believe it or not, that is the manufacturer. I'll be honest, I think this device is pretty much a B-Link because a lot of the terminology and usage around it was very similar. So, absolutely amazing device. Will I use it in my home lab long term? Maybe. I don't know. Because to be honest, I've got the little bit of a bug for these mini PCs now. Obviously the B-Link, annoyingly, I bought this and then subsequently realised there is another model. So there is the S12 now EQ, which does have 2.5 gigabit connections. So maybe at some point when I decide that I do want a third one in, maybe I'll look at one of these, but the EQ version to add that 2.5 gigabit connectivity. But again, an absolutely outstanding performer. And for the price, can't really go wrong. However, my standout, and this is no surprise, because let's be honest, we all know how good Intel NUCs are. Now, the reason I went for this is because at the time there was quite a disparity on cost between this and the B-Link equivalent, which I think is an S12 IE device. Now, because the NUC 13's come out, the prices of these have crashed somewhat, and I picked this up for around about similar prices to what I could get the B-Link for, because unfortunately those B-Link have been so popular, they've flown off the shelves, so people are profiteering a little bit off them. But this device is absolutely outstanding. Now, it's not obviously designed for gaming. Don't get me wrong, it could game and it could emulate. And if, like I said, when I do the individual reviews of these, you'll kind of see what I was able to achieve with those. Every one of these devices could do emulation to a degree, if that's what you want to do, or play certain video games to a degree. Obviously, my requirement were very different, and I was kind of looking at what I could get to run, from an efficiency point of view, in my rack that would work with my existing technology. This one out of the box comes with 2.5 gigabits, so bang, that's decent enough for me at the moment. I could add 10 gigabit connectivity via a USB-C, although that will add additional power consumption and headroom. And obviously there is a new version of the B-Link out, which I can go and get. But every one of them kind of ticks every single box for a different reason. Primarily what I was looking for is something that kind of idled around at about under that 20 watts. Now obviously you're probably thinking, God Andy, what are you on about? You've just gone from something that was running at 75 watts to now 3 devices that are running at 60. Well, I haven't, have I? Because this one can idle as low as 8, and this one probably as low as 6. Doesn't mean they always will, because there's so many environmental variables, and doing testing at the moment probably wasn't the best time, because let's be honest, it's absolutely sweltering out there, so everything's getting worked a little bit harder. However, obviously this one isn't getting used in my cluster at all, and therefore I'm only really using the two. And short term, that's probably what I'm going to stick with, because what I'm going to do is take a snapshot of my energy consumption for the last month, run this setup now for 30 to 60 days, and I will do a follow-up video, and I will also post regularly throughout this, just to kind of give you a little bit of feedback on what's changed from my energy consumption point of view. And I know it's so different of me saying, I want more power. If you like what we've covered today, hit the like and subscribe. And then that way, maybe I can afford not to worry about how much energy I use. But then I don't necessarily want to kill the planet either. So think smart, use less power.